Before we start the Seder, there are certain things that you need to know just in general about the Seder plate, that we try to take fruits that reflect on the characteristic of the Jewish people. And that's why when you take apples and nuts, and some people will add ginger, these things are there for a specific purpose. The charoses is supposed to remind us of the mortar, the bricks. And into the charoses we pour some wine. The wine is usually dry wine. And the reason for that is that not only does it change the consistency and make it into a mush similar to the slime that was used for mud, but it's also sour because of its effect. Souring is something that causes the teeth to fall out. And the frustrations that we had in Egypt caused us great angst, and the most important frustration was not the bricks. The most important frustration were the children. That's why there are two plates of mortar on the Seder table. One plate of mortar for the bitterness of the work, and the other plate of mortar, which we use for the korech, for the matzah sandwich, represents the bitterness that we had and the angst that we had over our children. After World War II, almost all of the survivors married immediately and immediately had children. In fact, you went down the streets of New York, of Brooklyn, where I grew up, and every couple that was known to my parents had a baby carriage. And the reason was they wanted to rebuild and felt necessary to rebuild Jewish life, because the greatest frustration that they had, that Jews have had over all of these centuries, was what happened to the children in all of the persecutions. And that is why the second plate of mortar is found in the second triangle, the bottom of the second triangle. There is a circle, and ideally it doesn't go around the circle, but it's two on top, one in the center, two on top, one in the center, two triangles. And of course these are Kabbalistic in nature, in their symbolism. But the second point of the triangle represents our relationship, the results and products of our relationships, and the bitterness and the frustration that went into that. And that's why the main topic, the main element of the Seder is v'higadato levincha. You must tell it to your child, because that was the main frustration, and the main purpose of the Exodus was not for the people who were slaves, because they ultimately died out in the desert, and they had a slave mentality and they could not go forward. It was for the children, that there should be a new generation, and that the new generation would shut off the clothing of the previous generation, and not be intimidated, and not feel overwhelmed by the nations of the world, and not feel overwhelmed by their mores, and not feel overwhelmed by their wisdom. As the Chazal tell us, the rabbis and the Talmud tell us, Chochma bagoyim tamim. If someone tells you there is wisdom among the nations, believe it. There is wisdom among the nations. But Torah bagoyim, Torah, which means life instruction, life values, principles of life that are true and everlasting, al tamim, don't believe it. Because the only place where there are true and everlasting values is found in the Torah. The power of the Torah can transform the most gross of a character and transform this person into the most righteous of people, not just externally, outwardly, person looking very, very pious in a particular meditative pose, but that this actually makes a change in the person's own nature. As we know the story of Aristotle, who was given temptation and could not withhold and withstand himself from the temptation, and became just like an animal in his conduct. Whereas the famous Rabbi Akiva, who for the first 40 years of his life was a shepherd, engaged in shepherd stuff, with all of the passions and all of the desires and all of the lifestyle of a shepherd. And he became a shepherd of men and the leader of Torah observant people. When faced with that same confrontation, a woman exposed herself to try to trap him. He spat, he cried, and he laughed. He spat because this is antithetical to proper behavior. He cried because that person who engaged in this kind of behavior eventually would die and lose their opportunity for eternal life. And then he laughed because he remembered that we all have the power to change. But the most important people who have the power to change and change the life and the destiny of the world are the children.